We're exploring the topic of preaching Christ from the Old Testament this morning, and in our first session, we considered the merits along with the means by which this has been accomplished. But as I mentioned earlier, our ultimate intention is to pass them through the dual filters of a dispensational hermeneutic and an expository homiletic. And so to that end, we turn our attention now to those filters. And I've heard it said that hermeneutics drives preaching, and so perhaps it is best to start with the driver, specifically the dispensational hermeneutic. Now, as many of you are aware, we immediately encounter something of a problem when seeking to describe the dispensational hermeneutic, and that's that there's more than one of them. Especially with the advent of progressive dispensationalism, there's now at least two distinct hermeneutical methods that would define themselves as dispensational, methods that I believe in some significant ways are not just divergent, but actually contradictory. And so that's why I've elected to speak of this filter as a dispensational hermeneutic rather than the dispensational hermeneutic. And so to clarify, the one that I promote in this section aligns with more closely with that of the hermeneutic of traditional dispensationalism. Hermeneutics in its biblical application is the art and science of interpreting Scripture. It's not the same as interpretation, rather it's the theory that stands behind it. And at its heart, its objective is to answer, what does the text mean? The answer, despite postmodernism's claims to the contrary, is that it means what the author meant. And this is what surfaces, I think, is the first essential plank of dispensational hermeneutics, and that is that it is authorial. Literary critic E.D. Hirsch summarizes authorial intention as, quote, the sensible belief that a text means what the author meant, unquote. Perhaps, as I mentioned, not so sensible anymore in the wake of postmodernism's reader-centered interpretations, but I trust sensible to us. And yet when applied to Scripture, it's complicated by the text's dual authorship, one human, the other divine. And so when considering the biblical author's intentions, a common rejoinder becomes, well, which one? And this raises a question concerning the nature of interpretation, and more specifically, the relationship between the intentions of the divine and human authors. Now, I'll just lay my cards on the table here. I affirm the unitary authorship of Scripture. In other words, I believe that both authors work in perfect confluence so that their intended meanings were absolutely coextensive. And as such, I believe that the very question of which author assumes a dichotomy that I find to be false. For as I understand inspiration, the human intention is the divine intention. In other words, there is an identity, as John Frame defines it, between the divine word and the human word. However, not everyone within dispensationalism sees the dual author's meanings as coextensive. Progressive dispensationalist Darrell Bach, for example, rejects the position as too narrow a view. Instead, he advocates a hermeneutical approach that permits a distinction between the human and divine intentions. And in doing so, he leaves space for a different, albeit complementary, meaning to arise beyond the scope of the human's conscious intention. And with this distinction, I see two layers of meaning that emerge inevitably. While the divine author could never mean less than what the human author meant, the assumption here is that he certainly could mean more. And so this surplus of meaning is, in Bach's words, a change by addition. A passage often referenced to demonstrate this change is 1 Peter 1, 10 and 11. Here it's argued that Peter affirms a distinction in meanings when he writes in verse 10, concerning this salvation, the prophets who prophesied about the grace that was to be yours searched and inquired carefully, inquiring what person or time the Spirit of Christ in them was indicating when he predicted the sufferings of Christ and the subsequent glories. From this text, there's simply no denying that Peter sees a distinction between the human and divine authors. The prophets' inquiries into their prophecies reveals a measure of ignorance not shared by the divine author. However, I believe that this distinction between the authors does not reside in the meaning of the text, but rather in its significance. See, the prophets were not confused about what their prophecies meant. They knew that their words, they knew what they meant. The unknown for them concerned the timing and the identity of the prophetic referent. In fact, I think it's not unlike the New Testament prophecies concerning the Antichrist, for example. The unknown is not what, it's who and when. And so here's my swing at a visual for the distinction. When I speak of the shared intentions of the human and divine authors, I'm referring to their meaning, the specifically intended idea expressed in their text. This does not, however, demand that both authors share the same comprehensive understanding of the significance of their text. That's what we see, I believe, in 1 Peter 1. God's knowledge is infinite, and as such, his understanding of the text's applications, implications, and ramifications exceed that of the human authors. But again, those concerns are one of significance, not meaning. And so to summarize, meaning is the interpretation of the text, and that's single, fixed, and unchanging. Significance, however, is its implications, applications, and ramifications, and those are multiple. But notice not only the distinction, but also their necessary relationship. A text's significance must cohere to the author's intended meaning. In other words, the meaning of a text directly governs and controls its significance. Not every application is legitimate. In order for it to be valid, it must be consistent with what the author meant. So by authorial, I mean that the words mean what the author meant. And as such, our hermeneutical task is to discern the author's intentions. And when applied to Scripture, its dual authorship doesn't necessarily complicate this consideration, since two authors does not demand two meanings. And so our concern should be to discern the human author's intended meaning, striving like the Apostle Paul in Acts 26:22 to say nothing other than what the prophets and Moses said. But this raises the question of how to discern the author's intention. Obviously, we can't drill into their minds or even ask them what they meant. But thankfully, we don't have to, because it is possible to discern their intentions from their text. And this brings us to the next aspect of the dispensational hermeneutic, the grammatical historical interpretation of Scripture. For the dispensationalist, the means of interpreting the text, at least historically, has been variously described as direct, natural, plain, ordinary, or normal. Such descriptions, however, have received pushback from the non-dispensationalists, particularly because the terms can feel loaded. Right? I mean, if ours is the normal reading, what does that make everyone else's? But the most enduring description is the one from Charles Ryrie in his book Dispensationalism, and that's the literal interpretation of the text. Some understand this to preclude space for figurative language. A few years ago, I was listening to my then 4-year-old daughter Adeline with her 4-year-old cousin Maddie, and Maddie came into the living room. They were having a conversation. She said, "God is an artist. He painted the rainbow in the sky." To which my daughter asserted quite emphatically, "No, he didn't. He doesn't have a paintbrush." So my daughter's she's more of a wooden literalist. But this is not that. By literalist, we don't mean we can't recognize symbols or figures of speech. Instead, the point of literal is that it is an interpretation that plays by the rules of language. And so a literal interpretation recognizes symbolic, hyperbolic, ironic meanings, but only the ones that are deliberately intended by the author. But as you probably know, this term has its troubles too, and that is due in part to the elasticity of the term literal. Even the reformers, who together championed a literal sense over and against the fourfold method of the medieval church, could not agree among themselves on the nature of the literal hermeneutic. In fact, as Van Hooser notes, quote, "Some of Calvin's contemporaries accused him of so historizing his interpretations as to de-Christianize them. Thus it actually earned him the label Judaizing Calvin." And so even a cursory survey of the biblical interpretation would quickly confirm Brevard, is that how you pronounce his name? Brevard Childs. It would confirm his conclusion that there are, quote, "few more perplexing problems in the history of biblical interpretation than the issue of defining what is meant by the literal sense of the text," unquote. So the term has limited utility in distinguishing the dispensationalist hermeneutic from its alternatives, simply because of the array of opinions concerning what a literal hermeneutic actually consists of. So for me, the description I find to be most helpful is the grammatical historical interpretation. By grammatical, I mean essentially the same thing as literal, that the meaning of Scripture is derived from a plain reading of the text. And by historical, I mean that the reading is sensitive to the message as it came to its original audience. This encompasses a range of considerations that ground the text in its time. things including culture, customs, languages, geography, social structures. Included here, too, as well, are the literary features of the Bible's ancient genres. As you know, the literary character of Scripture is not monolithic. Instead, the biblical record contains a wide variety of disparate genres, from narrative and prose to poetry and prophecy, each with its own set of expectations and literary devices. And these forms and features create the authorially intended atmosphere in which the text is to be received. And as such, a knowledge of these forms is an essential historical part of understanding the passage. We read a proverb with different literary lenses than we do a prophecy or a poem or a narrative, which means that as we strive to answer what it means, we must also consider how it means. And so to summarize, the grammatical historical method interprets the meaning of the text according to the principles of grammar and the facts of history. And admittedly, this label garners criticism too, and the reason is because the grammatical historical method is by no means the sole property of dispensationalism. In fact, according to G.K. Beale, quote, the grammatical historical interpretive approach has been the traditionally accepted modern standard of a proper interpretive method. So the objection is that we cannot claim it as the distinguishing characteristic of the dispensational hermeneutic, and I think that's duly noted. However, what makes this method unique within dispensationalism, in my opinion, is its usage. The dispensational hermeneutic claims a consistent application of the grammatical historical method from Genesis to Revelation, which admittedly may be a loaded qualifier as well, but I think it's warranted. And so it's with this qualifier of consistency, particularly as it's applied to predictive prophecy, that the grammatical historical hermeneutic finds, as I see it, a unique distinction within dispensationalism. And as something of a footnote, this is how dispensationalism gets branded as a system of discontinuity, because its literal interpretation of the covenantal promises and predictive prophecies draws a distinction between Old Testament Israel and New Testament church. And I think it's a fair designation, but I think it's helpful to note that the reason for the discontinuity between Old Testament Israel and New Testament church is due, in my opinion, to the hermeneutical continuity between Old Testament promise and New Testament fulfillment. The patriarchs and the kings and the prophets and Israelites all understood their covenantal promises literally, and dispensationalism carries that continuity right through to its fulfillment. Conversely, in order for covenantalism, the system of continuity, to sustain its view of Israel and the church as the one continuous people of God, I think it must adopt a hermeneutical discontinuity between the Old Testament expectation and the New Testament fulfillment. So all that to say, the continuity-discontinuity designations aren't necessarily as clean and self-evident and simple as they first appear. In any case, I describe the dispensational hermeneutic as a consistent application of the grammatical historical method of interpretation. But at risk of overstuffing this explanation beyond its usefulness, I do want to add one more description to the train, and that is the dispensational hermeneutic is theological. I include the theological piece because the Old Testament writers were scholars and theologians and exegetes, which means their inspired writings are thoroughly interconnected. And as such, our interpretation must account for the thick theological meaning of their text in relation to and interaction with the rest of Scripture. And while theological interpretation is broadly affirmed within evangelical hermeneutics, there's significant disagreement concerning how it's discerned. Some, pressing the principle of the analogy of faith, assert that the meaning of any given text is not merely informed or controlled by the other canonical texts, but in some cases is reinterpreted by them. This canonical or whole Bible reading uses a broader canon as the lens through which Old Testament texts are interpreted. And I think in principle this amounts to prioritizing the New Testament as the clearer, more complete revelation. And in practice, it can create a back-to-front reading of Scripture in which the New Testament is read into the Old Testament. As Graham Goldsworthy explains it, he says, quote, "We do not start at Genesis 1 and work our way forward. Rather, we first come to Christ, and He directs us to study the Old Testament in light of the gospel. The gospel will interpret the Old Testament by showing us its goal and meaning," unquote. This is the presuppositional commitment behind the gospel-centered hermeneutic, a hermeneutic that I believe blossoms into a Christ-centered homiletic. a backward reading of Scripture that sees Christ as the hermeneutical key that unlocks the truest meaning of the Old Testament. Such a method, it is argued, is actually asserted that Christ supports this himself. You'll recall the account of Jesus with the two disciples on the Emmaus Road, where, beginning with Moses and all the prophets in verse 24, he interpreted to them in all the Scripture the things concerning himself. Many gospel-centered advocates see in this text the genesis of something of a paradigm shift in the way we are to interpret Scripture. It's here, notes Goldworthy, quote, that Jesus is giving the disciples the key to understanding the Old Testament as a whole. Or as David King articulates it, in this text, Jesus changes how we read the Old Testament, requiring of every passage, without exception, an interpretation involving Jesus. This is what they see Jesus doing with those two travelers when he interprets the things concerning himself in all the Scripture, that is, in every text of Scripture. Or for some, pressing down even further, every word of Scripture. Dr. Moeller, for example, cites the text to argue that, quote, from Moses to the prophets, Jesus is the focus of every single word of the Bible, unquote. There are, however, a couple problems with seeing Christ as the hermeneutical key from this text. First, it doesn't, I think, adequately explain Jesus' rebuke, O foolish ones and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. If Jesus holds the secret cipher needed to decode the meaning of the Old Testament, it's hard to see why these travelers would be rebuked for not seeing what they couldn't. But the issue isn't their lack of understanding, is it? It's their lack of faith. They were slow of heart to believe all that the prophets had spoken. So again, there's nothing in the text that would suggest any kind of hermeneutical shift. And that's because it wasn't an interpretation problem, it was a belief problem. That's where the moral culpability lies here. Furthermore, the narrative simply doesn't support the conclusion that every text in the Old Testament is about Jesus, let alone every word. Consider again Luke's comment. And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the Scriptures the things concerning himself. Luke does not say that Jesus interpreted every text in all the Scriptures to concern himself, but that he interpreted in all the Scriptures the things concerning himself. And in all the Scriptures, as I think verse 44 will make clear, he's referring to all the portions of Scripture, Moses, prophets, Psalms. And so he's pointing from those portions the texts that concern himself. And on a practical note, the road from Jerusalem to Emmaus was only 7 miles long. So if Jesus did what some have suggested, finding himself in every text and clause and word, I'd imagine it would have to be a little longer than 7 miles, even if you're walking it. But there are other texts that are used to justify this hermeneutical shift, and it is not my intention or expertise to address each one, but one that does appear with relative frequency is the 2 Corinthians text, chapter 3, verse 14 and following. We're drawing on the analogy of Moses' veil placed over his shiny face. Paul writes in verse 14, but their minds were hardened, for to this day when they read the Old Covenant, the same veil remains unlifted, because only through Christ is it taken away. Yes, to this day, whenever Moses is read, a veil lies over their hearts. But when one turns to the Lord, the veil is removed. So here it's argued that Paul is championing Christ as the missing piece that uplifts the veil and unlocks the Old Testament meaning. Regarding this text, Jason DeRoshi comments, quote, apart from Jesus, the Jews could not fully see and savor the beauty of God bound up in the Scriptures, unquote. Steve Wellum concurs, concluding from this text that, quote, apart from Christ, the Old Testament remained vague and opaque. But what I wonder does this do to the clarity of Scripture? Are we to conclude that God's special revelation to Israel was vague and opaque? A fuzzy scene that needed a Christological lens to sharpen? My concern with this view is that it challenges the Old Testament's ability to speak clearly for itself and on its own terms, and as such, it functionally denies that its message can be understood by the original audience. And so I don't think a hermeneutical shift is in view here either, for their failure to see the glory of the Lord was not because they couldn't decipher its meaning, but because they wouldn't accept its significance for themselves, because chapter 4, verse 4, the God of this world had blinded the minds of the unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ. So again, it wasn't an interpretation problem. It was a belief problem. That's what I believe Christ addresses here. They needed the Spirit's illuminating work, not to reveal some hidden or deeper meaning within the text, but to welcome, embrace, and apply that meaning for themselves. I think Kevin Van Hooser is correct when he writes, quote, "With regard to hermeneutics, the role of the Spirit is to serve as the spirit of significance, and thus to apply meaning, not to change it." So to clarify, by theological interpretation, I don't mean a back-to-front reading that interprets Old Testament meaning through the New Testament lens. What I would propose instead is a forward reading of Scripture where each text is interpreted along the trajectory of progressive revelation, namely from front to back. With this forward interpretive trajectory, any theological freight that's baked into the exegesis must be antecedent to the author's writings. In other words, it must be established from the text and historical context that the human author was cognizant of the theological meaning at the time of his writings. In this regard, I agree with Henry Virkler's definition of theological analysis. He says, quote, "Theological analysis studies the level of theological understanding at the time a revelation was given in order to ascertain the meaning of the text for its original recipients." This is what we mean by front-to-back reading of Scripture, namely that we interpret later texts in light of earlier texts and not the other way around. As Abner Chao so helpfully summarized it, quote, "We establish the theology of their writings through their linguistic connections with antecedent passages." And speaking of Abner Chao, I would commend to you his book. I think I saw it on the table up there in the front, Hermeneutics of the Biblical Writers. There he makes the compelling case that while it's common to conclude that the Old Testament prophets spoke better than they knew, it's actually more likely that they spoke better than we give them credit for. I mentioned in a little promo video for this series my encounter with a little boy at a summer kids program, boys versus girls, final question, right here in the front. He stood up and I asked him, "How many times did Israel march around the city of Jericho on the seventh day?" And he looked up at me and he said, "Jesus died on the cross for my sins?" And then all the little eyes turned to me waiting for the answer, and I said, "That is correct." And the boys were ecstatic and the girls were frustrated, and despite my response, I sympathize with the girls. And I think the reason is there's something inside of us that intuitively knows that that's not how language works. When I interpret the siege of Jericho to mean that Jesus died for my sins, most of you would get the feeling that I'm not playing by the rules. See, language is a God-given capacity that was given for the sake of communication, which inevitably demands interpretive rules. And a text unhitched from its rules introduces an instability to the text that renders communication and comprehension ultimately hopeless. And that's why I believe that the received laws of language must govern, ground, and guide our hermeneutical method if we have any hope of understanding the meaning of the text. And I believe the dispensational hermeneutic endeavors to do that. So that's the first filter, a dispensational hermeneutic. An interpretive method that I define as a consistent application of an authorial, grammatical, historical, theological interpretation of Scripture. But now the second filter, and that's the expository homiletic. Expository preaching is a particular homiletical method, often contrasted with its alternatives, like topical, evangelistic, biographical sermons. In general terms, the distinguishing characteristic of the expository hermeneutic is its intention to expose the text, to proclaim what the text proclaims. However, over time, expository preaching as a term has expanded and evolved so significantly that there's really no clear consensus on a definition. And so in lieu of a single definition, what I'd like to do here, just for clarity's sake, is to identify what I believe to be the 5 key components of expository preaching. While not every expository preacher will accept these 5 characteristics in totality or in description, nevertheless, I believe they represent some of the most common features of the expository sermon, each of which I see as essential. So we'll take each one briefly together in turn. The first is this: the sermon is sourced in one complete expository unit. One of the distinctions of expository preaching is its focus on a single biblical text. While additional passages may serve various illustrative, supportive purposes, the expositional attention of the sermon remains tethered to the primary text. And by complete expository unit, I mean that it cannot be fragmentary. Instead, it must encompass enough material to represent a unified span of thought and content. Since paragraphs embody a complete textual idea, they often function well as expository units. However, it is helpful to bear in mind, first, that paragraph breaks are not inspired, and second, this paragraph correlation is not always absolute. As preachers and teachers in this room would acknowledge, in some cases, an expository unit can be as short as one line in the Proverbs, or it could be as expansive to encompass several chapters, particularly in the historical narratives. The important thing here is that the text and not the preacher establish the borders of the passage. And admittedly, there are times where there's ambiguity at the edges. However, this doesn't excuse us from the task of marking out as best we can their boundaries. And the reason is a disregard for these borders could lead to a distorted understanding of the author's intention. It would be like entering mid-conversation into someone else's conversation. But number two, the meaning is discerned through sound exegesis. Our charge is to accurately represent the text, and as I just unpacked, I believe that this is best accomplished by means of a consistent application of a grammatical, historical, theological hermeneutic. So we'll just jump on to the third one, and that's this. The unit is situated within its various contexts. This is a vital part of our exposition, for to echo the popular adage, a text without context is pretext. And I see three contextual horizons for each text, and I like Jason DeRoche's classifications here: the close, continuing, and complete contexts. So first, the close context. While each unit is, in one sense, self-sufficient, no passage stands alone. Rather, each unit functions within a larger developmental section and book, and as such, we must consider the unit's relationship within its neighboring units, along with its unique contribution within the book. Panning out further, we consider the text within its continuing context. Here we consider how the unit is informed by and contributes to the theology of antecedent Scripture. You'll recall the prophets are theologians, and as such their writings are both influenced by and add to the revelation that preceded theirs. And the final contextual horizon is the complete context. Here we consider the unit's placement within the completed canon, seeing where it fits within the sweeping arc of biblical history. But again, when considering this complete context, I maintain that any backward reading of Scripture must not manipulate the meaning of the antecedent revelation. While this context enables us to apply the Old Testament in light of the New, we must not reinterpret the Old Testament in light of the New. But number four, the sermon reflects the expository unit. While the degree of reflection is debated, the common denominator is the conviction that the expository sermon resembles the text. This is rooted in the belief that our authority in preaching does not reside in our office, our intellect, or our experience, but in the word we preach. And so the degree to which we stray from the word is the same degree in which our authority is diminished. And so as I see it, the closer we stick to the text, the better. An expository sermon should reflect the text. First, it should reflect the text theme. When I was in junior high, I decided I would try to sign up for a preaching contest at like a local Christian school thing, and there was two choices. It was topical preaching or expository preaching, and I asked my friend, what is the difference? And he said, well, one has a topic, and the other doesn't. And that's the conception, isn't it, right? Well, if you don't have a topic, then you're expository. But I don't think that's right. Instead, the key distinction between topical and expository is not the presence of a theme or a topic, but rather its source. While topical preaching tends to bring its theme to the text, expository preaching draws its theme from it. So to state it simply, the sermonic theme must relate to the textual theme. The second is the purpose, that which the author intends to accomplish with what he's writing. Such an expectation demands that the biblical author's goal in writing govern the preacher's goal in preaching. For we may know a lot of true facts about the text, but until we've understood its purpose, we're not yet ready to preach its truth. And this shades into what I was talking about with what the author's doing, why he's saying what he's saying, his pragmatics. Such reflection doesn't demand an exact replication, but rather, I think, an accurate correlation. In other words, while it's often necessary for the preacher to recontextualize the purpose, to conform to the present context, in light of the new dispensation, in light of the placement in history, etc., I think we need to maintain the integrity of the original purpose. And at minimum, as one author put it, they both should be going in the same general direction. And this is another concern that I have with perhaps an overly zealous Christocentric homiletic. In some cases, in practice, if not in principle, its determination to place Christ, kind of its presuppositional commitment to find or place Christ as the theme and purpose of every sermon, can in many cases, I think, neglect the text's unique theme and thrust, and in some cases even supplant it. For while I do believe every textual unit relates to Christ, directly or indirectly, I'm not convinced every text is about Christ or is centered on Christ. But next, the sermon must reflect the text's substance. Here, the content of the passage in its entirety provides the content of the sermon. In many ways, this represents the essence of expository preaching. More than mere method, expository preaching is a philosophical commitment to declare only what the Scriptures declare, to unpack everything the text says. And fourth, the sermon should reflect the expository unit's structure. John Stott champions this as the golden rule of sermonic outlines, declaring that, quote, each text must be allowed to supply its own structure, unquote. The advantage of reflecting the text's structure in the sermon is that it preserves the literary shape of the expository unit, rather than fitting every passage into the prefabricated framework of 3 points in a poem. Yielding the sermon structure to the text's form permits the truths to develop in their originally intended way. As such, narratives retain their arcing plot, poems their sensory aesthetic, and epistles their ordered arguments. However, the degree of structural reflection is admittedly disputed. Some, like Kaiser, would assert that the structure transfer be near total, arguing for a textual expository preaching that, quote, lets the Scripture have the major, if not the only role in determining the shape, logic, and development of the message, unquote. In this view, the sermon replicates the substance and sequence of its outline, both main points, subpoints, directly from the expository unit. As it concerns our topic of preaching Christ from the Old Testament, such a close reflection of the text leaves little allowance for preaching Christ from the text unless he explicitly appears within the text. Others, however, see this view as excessive. Greidanus, for example, warns that such a slavish imitation to the text is too rigid, arguing instead for a posture of what he calls respect for the text. Chapel 2, while affirming the merits of structural reflection, warns that, quote, a wooden mirroring of the sequence of a text may actually misrepresent the truth of the text. And so as I see it, it seems best to define the relationship as one of influence. Within this dynamic, the textual structure provides the governing framework for the sermon structure. And this posture of influence, in my view, preserves a relational hierarchy between the text and the sermon, with the former as the master of the latter. This then does leave space for preaching Christ from the text, I believe, showing at relevant points how the text connects to Christ, while still maintaining the structural influence of the passage. But finally, one reflection that I haven't considered significantly until more recently, and that's the text's tone. We all know that Scripture is not a sterile and impassive treatise. Rather, its pages are laced with feeling and passion and emotion. Such potent affections are not, I believe, a barrier to the text's intention, but the author's ally in communicating his message. As such, a comprehensive vision of the author's message and intentions must communicate both the message and the mood, its logos and its pathos. And I never really thought about this significantly, but I am convinced that this is important, primarily because a distorted tone can result in a distorted message. If your only preaching setting is fiery confrontation, then some texts will resonate, but others may warp. And so the passage of Scripture, as we know, falls on various places along the tonal spectrum, from lament and imprecation to joy and celebration. and if the tone of the sermon contradicts the tone of the text, I think the message will likely distort. But the fifth and final characteristic is that the significance of the text is brought to bear on the modern audience. The expository sermon should drive its exegetical activity towards application. In fact, it's not just the helpful add-on. I believe it's the necessary goal. And it's here in the applicational component of preaching that I believe we find an abundance of viable, homiletically justified movements to Christ. But as we noted earlier, not all and any application will do. In order for it to be a valid application, it must spring from the meaning of the text as a natural and necessary consequence of the authorially intended meaning. While it's possible to draw all manner of ancillary applications from incidental parts of the passage, valid contemporary applications should correspond with the author's ancient ones. However, we must be careful when making that applicational move from there to here, because it is rarely as simple, as you know, as copy-paste. In some places, the applicational transfer is direct. However, in many others, the vast historical dispensational distance between then and now complicates the transfer. And in these cases, the preacher must abstract the truths from the ancient text with all its situational historical specificity to reveal its enduring and timeless truth. This principalizing process enables us to traverse the gap between the ancient text and the modern audience. But while these principles do offer legitimate trans-historical application, they often lack relevance if left in the stratosphere of timeless principles. And so the applicational transfer is incomplete until the principle descends from its timeless abstraction and comes to rest in the concrete specificity of modern experience. And it's often here in the sphere of modern-day relevance that I think the Old Testament sermon relates to Christ. And it will be this relationship that we consider in our third and final lecture.